I am Alacrity from Alabama, and I shall be swift.
Alacrity from Alabama. Swift
Yes,
Alacrity. Okay.
yes. So I watched your Yaron versus
Your
Seder
own.
debate. I watched it, and I just wanted to ask you a point. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's your own, I believe is how you pronounce his name.
Oh, forgive me. Anyway, I watched the debate, and there was this one point that there were several points, but the one that stood out to me the most was when you were addressing slavery with him, and you mentioned how you had interviewed several authors about slavery, about how it was largely responsible for the economic boons experienced by various countries around the world, developed what are now developed countries that were developing then from slavery and the slave triangle, like Matt said. So I just wanted to say that I think that is a bit, I don't know who the authors you spoke to were, but I think that is a bit of an oversimplification, given the fact that slavery, while yes, it can be used to generate capital formation, it does have several detrimental effects technologically and industrially. In fact, it's the abundance of slave labor that can actually inhibit technological advancement. And I have empirical evidence for this. Would you like me to detail it? I have some
No.
data.
I mean, the idea that if I have free labor, an endless supply of free labor to pick cotton, so I don't now have to develop a mechanized cotton picker. Yeah, I mean, that doesn't seem terribly profound to me.
Well, I see, but what is the point then when you say that slavery is used, that slavery was a driving force of industrialization, economic growth? Then when you say
This
that,
entire
because
project, here's what I would say: like tobacco in Virginia would not have been possible without slavery, without plantation slavery. Like, so whether it had later effects on depressing industrial development or whatever, it's just not. It gave you the chance to do it. That's where those profits came from. Those profits were not possible without slavery.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not even sure what the point of saying, like, well, on day one, because slavery is involved there, that, I mean, if your argument is, hey, these folks were idiots because they went for the low hanging fruit of enslaving people and getting free labor, and that's the way that they created the economic engine. They could have probably made 15 to 20% more had they waited a couple of years for somebody to invent a cotton picker.
But they invent it with the profits they got from slavery.
Of course. And let's be clear here. Like, the option of a plantation owner to, go and buy slaves or wait until someone invents a machine that picks cotton. Like, I don't even understand do I think that the existence of free labor that is far more accessible to everybody than machines that hypothetically might exist in the future were there not free labor? I'm not even sure of, like, aside from that not being terribly profound, what is the point of that? What does that have to do with the argument that we had with Yaron?
Well, a few things earlier. As you said earlier, that if my argument is that, well, they just should have waited for more inventions. No, I must say that is a mischaracterization. As how it relates back to your own, I'm not even sure what your point was in bringing it up in the first place.
I didn't bring up slavery. He did.
He said it was really easy to see whose fruits of the labor these are. It's easy to attribute, like ownership, and it's definitely not. The history of this entire continent is that is not the case.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just like the white people were brought over here in bondage to serve in those places too, mainly to balance out the black demography.
Well, first of all, Mr. Seder, I wanted to mention that if you, again, as I say, I was addressing specifically when you defended it after Yaron had got done saying his bit. You then came in and said with the author, that you had interviewed like half a dozen authors, and you had said that was the case. But the thing is that
you're not even refuting my point. You're simply saying that they could have made more if they didn't use slavery. That's a hypothetical that could be possible, but the point is they did get slaves, and it did drive the free labor did drive the development of a cotton industry, or in the case of Virginia, a tobacco industry. It did provide opportunities for bankers in the North to finance and export.
Early ports in the North were like servicing those ships. That's what, like, get some turpentine from like Boston, right? Like that's what those ports were important for, because the real money was in getting slaves to the Caribbean and sugar and rum out of there.
Yes. I mean, I don't know, the idea that if I start a YouTube channel and I get a bunch of views and I monetize it, well, that may be the case, but you haven't optimized it. Well, okay, so there's room for me to make 20% more. I mean, even if I stipulate what you're talking about, which I will for the sake of argument, because I find it a completely irrelevant argument. What is your point?
My point is that you've grossly overstated the role that it played. For example, some studies say it's only responsible for about 5 to 13% of the capital formation. In fact, the role of slavery is even more detrimental to.
I'm sorry, you look at these stats, but how about looking at history? Like any of these colonies, dude, you look at the formation of these colonies and who's building stuff, who's chopping the trees down.
Mr. Seder, I was not unable to hear what Matt, I believe that's Matt, I don't know who that was.
Matt is saying that you are not accounting, you're looking at hypotheticals about.
No, I wasn't finished yet.
Excuse me.
I was not.
I'm going to explain to you what he is saying. You're looking at hypotheticals that are telling you that there could have been a greater return if they didn't use slaves and they developed technology. And Matt is telling you, look at history. Look at the way that the people organize themselves. Look at where the sources of revenue and economic activity were happening, and you can see that they would import a bunch of slaves. Now, maybe they weren't doing it efficiently enough, and maybe I overstated the percentage in which people, but the absence of technology, because slavery may have inhibited technology's growth, doesn't in any way contradict the notion that the economy and that slavery drove all this economic activity.
Yes, it does, because if it's only responsible for about 5 to 13% of capital formation, you aren't accounting for the other factors. For example, if you look at the roots of the Industrial Revolution, you actually find that there is an incentive for industrialization where wages were higher. For example, in Britain,
wait a second. Listen. No, wait. Here's why I'm interrupting you. I don't care. I don't care. I mean, even if you are 100% right, let me stipulate, you're 100% right. I grossly overstated the amount that slavery, it was just more of like there was no economic incentive for anybody to maintain slaves. It was more of just like
they were doing it for
hobby.
fun. They hated black people that much.
It was a hobby, and it was just out and out racism. What's your point? I've stipulated your point.
My point is that when you talk about slavery in relation to capitalism, often as in the context you're referring to it, you're drawing implications from it, economic implications from it, that are simply flawed when you overstate the amount, is all that I'm saying. For example, as I was saying, if you look at the roots of the Industrial Revolution.
Let me tell you something. I don't care.
Bro.
I honestly don't care. I will stipulate that slavery, there's two opinions about slavery. One is that it drove economic activity. And the other opinion is yours, that it's just about specifically wanting to imprison people from Africa and get their free labor because it was more of like a hobby, or maybe it was a status symbol or something like that. Either way, it doesn't really, I mean, I guess in your mind, it protects criticism of capitalism and a critique of capitalism. But then I would say, like, well, people were accumulating too much money if that's what their hobby was. I would say that we need to have confiscatory taxation so that we cannot develop such hobbies that would lead to the brutalization and the enslavement.
Most hobbies don't. Most hobbies are like collecting baseball cards. It doesn't necessarily. Well, I guess they do accumulate in, or playing fantasy football doesn't mean that you're accumulating wealth and enslaving people.
Well, what you stated, my opinion was that people just did it as a hobby. No, that's a gross mischaracterization. There is plenty of room for irrational economic behavior. My point is,
they were
is
very
that
irrationally economically behaved. I mean, look, dude, go read about the Industrial Revolution. Go read about like what drove. Go look at the numbers of slaves that are imported as the ability for technology to weave the cotton, to ship the cotton.
That is not the only thing that I was stating. As I'm trying to state, slavery existed almost everywhere in world history. It's existed for thousands of years. So slavery was not the driving factor. But if you look at places where the Industrial Revolution occurred, and you look at wage rates, for example, in Britain before the Industrial Revolution.
Dude, you know what? Honestly,
you're full of shit.
Like this is the most masturbatory conversation I could imagine. It has nothing to do with the conversation I had with Yaron. It has nothing to do with anything. I don't understand what your point is. Tell me your point.
Explain, but I keep getting interrupted, Mr. Seder. Oh. Anyway, as I was saying, slavery existed everywhere in the world and existed for thousands of years. So you need to look at what makes places different if you want to see if you want to understand the causes for new events like the Industrial Revolution. And there's empirical evidence that high wage, which existed in Britain, for example, in Britain, wages per day for workers were about 11 grams of silver per day, where in India or China, they're only about 3 or 4 grams of silver per day. So my point is, no.
All right. I'm sorry. You've been on the phone for 11 minutes. And if you haven't said your point by then it's just going to be a waste of time. And it's not because I was talking over you. It's because you're coming in and telling me that I had a gross miscalculation of the value of slavery to the economics of this country. Now, and I even stipulated that so that you could make your point. And if that's the only point, then okay, that's your argument.
This is what happens when you read econ to the exclusion of history.
Facts don't care about your feelings, Matt.
Like, go tell William Byrd II, owner of 200 slaves in Virginia, that, hey, actually, you could do this more profitably if you just hire white people. No, that wouldn't have worked. They would have, like, this is about control. Race is basically a technology for those people to exploit people based on the color of their skin. And they brought black people over because they were enslaving Native Americans, but guess what? They escape. And you have a problem with enslaving white people because you have the people from your home countries that have issues with that. So you enslave black people because that's where the profit for tobacco is.
Yep.
And the point he's trying to make is that industrialization was happening at a greater rate and making more money. Therefore, what slavery was like an artifact, basically, and not like a relevant driver of like American growth in terms of economic might.
The major input, like we think about these things like that. Libertarians like think they're like they know Econ 100. They need to know Econ 400, where you don't look at these things isolated from like the British economy is separate from the American one. No, where do you think where do you think that cotton is going?
What were some of those books?
Stop
King
it,
Cotton,
globalists.
What was the name of those books? We interviewed a couple of years ago. Like there was like 3 or 4 books on this that I invite that libertarian to read. King Cotton was one of them. I can't remember what the other 2.
Yeah, Sven Beckert's Slavery's Capitalism was like a few writers contributed to that one.
Yeah, I mean, but even if I concede the point, which I don't, but for the sake of argument, I stipulate that yes, everybody who owned slaves was irrational, and it was a drag on the economy to have all that free labor. So what? What's the point? There's
working
no
backwards from your conclusion that capitalism is an unfettered capitalism is,
and therefore capitalism is good.
Yeah.
It's not
because free labor. If free labor is not beneficial to the capitalist, then why should a $15 minimum wage be a problem? Why not just pay your labor whatever they want?
Yeah.
Why do we have a system that constrains wages?
It's denial of really horrid history too. Think of what
That's the
Pascal's
problem.
talking about, like about the Haitians where they're brought over at 18 to die at 25, because like that's those actuarial tables getting developed for capitalism. How much peak labor can we get out of this guy before he kicks it? And we need to bring over another boatload, which like maybe 50 will die on the way over and we'll get 100, but that's still good labor for another 5 years. That's the way that they were thinking back then.
Yep. And if it is the case that no wages inhibits technology, then maybe low wages does too. So maybe the argument we should be promoting for a $15 minimum wage, frankly, for a $25 minimum wage, is that we're going to see the increase in the value of technology. I mean, but also that also reveals another aspect of a libertarian mindset. I would say, is that they're talking about economic principles as if we're not talking about human beings, like that there is no relationship between, the economy is something that exists in nature. And like in the same way that like we need to like take care of the climate, and that has an overriding, immediacy to, sort of like the desires of people to, I don't know, burn fossil fuel or whatnot. There is this notion that the economy is not a series of decisions that we make, but rather some thing, some force of nature that exists outside of human beings. And there should be no relationship between human suffering and what we perceive to be a healthy economy. It's just bizarre.
I thank him for calling in about that topic, though.
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.